On December 8, 1941, inside the Imperial Japanese Navy headquarters in Tokyo, telephones rang with disciplined calm. Reports arrived from Pearl Harbor: success, devastation, surprise.
Admirals nodded. The United States Pacific Fleet had been bloodied. Japan's southern advance, they believed, would now proceed without serious interference.
What they did not hear that morning was the sound that would haunt Japan for the next 4 years: the dull, underwater thud of an American torpedo detonating against a merchant hull. At the highest levels of Japanese planning, submarines were seen as fleet weapons, not commerce killers. Doctrine, inherited from decisive battle theory, imagined submarines softening enemy battleships before a climactic surface engagement. Merchant shipping, oil tankers, rice carriers, troop transports, was considered secondary. The assumption was simple and fatal. Japan's shipping lanes were too vast, too protected, too unimportant a target for the Americans to focus on. That assumption began to die on January 11, 1942, off the coast of Borneo, when the U.S. submarine USS Swordfish, SS-193, torpedoed the Japanese tanker Nishin Maru. The explosion ripped open the ship's belly, sending crude oil boiling across the black water. For the Japanese crew, many of them civilian sailors, the sea burned as much as it drowned. In Washington, this was not an accident. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, newly appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, had quietly authorized unrestricted submarine warfare against Japan on December 7, 1941, hours after Pearl Harbor. It was a radical decision, one that violated international conventions, but Nimitz understood something Tokyo did not. Japan was an island empire held together by shipping. By mid-1942, American submarines were ranging from the South China Sea to the Sea of Japan, slipping through narrow straits and shallow waters once considered impossible for enemy boats. Crews lived in steel tubes that stank of diesel fuel, sweat, and spoiled food. Condensation dripped constantly from overhead pipes. Men slept inches from torpedoes, knowing that a single depth charge could crush the hull like a soda can. On August 19, 1942, near Truk Lagoon, the submarine USS Gudgeon, SS-211, sank the Japanese transport Taian Maru, carrying aviation fuel desperately needed for Guadalcanal. Survivors clung to debris as sharks circled. That fuel would never reach the airfields. Japanese pilots would never fly those missions. On land, Marines would live who otherwise might not have. Inside Japanese merchant ships, fear grew sharper with every voyage. Sailors painted false bows on their hulls, zigzagged endlessly, and slept fully clothed. They listened for propeller beats in the water, for the unnatural silence that preceded an attack. Many were farmers or fishermen conscripted into service, not warriors, not trained for this invisible war. By 1943, the crisis could no longer be ignored. Japan had lost over 2 million tons of merchant shipping. Oil deliveries from the Dutch East Indies, Japan's lifeline, were collapsing. At Kure Naval Arsenal, engineers cannibalized old engines. Training flights were canceled to save fuel. Battleships sat idle, majestic and useless, their tanks nearly dry. American submariners, meanwhile, were refining their craft with ruthless precision. Early torpedo failures, the infamous Mark 14, had nearly cost the campaign, but by late 1943, fixes were implemented. Now, torpedoes ran true. Explosions were no longer dull thuds, but violent, ship-breaking roars. On November 29, 1943, the submarine USS Tang, SS-306, commanded by Richard O'Kane, attacked a convoy in the East China Sea. In less than an hour, Tang sank 3 ships. O'Kane's crew cheered quietly, then returned to their stations. There was no celebration, only calculation. How many torpedoes left, how deep the water was, how long before escorts arrived. The psychological strain was immense. Sonar pings echoed like hammer blows inside the hull. Depth charges rattled teeth and snapped light bulbs. Men prayed silently, imagining the ocean pressing in, inch by inch. Yet they kept going back out, patrol after patrol, because the results were undeniable. By mid-1944, Japanese cities felt the consequences. Rice rations shrank. Factories closed for lack of raw materials. On July 18, 1944, Prime Minister Hideki Tojo resigned, in part because Japan could no longer sustain the war economically. The Imperial Navy still had ships. It no longer had the fuel to move them. Perhaps the most devastating statistic came quietly, buried in logistics reports. Over 55% of all Japanese merchant sailors were killed during the war, more than any other service branch. They died not in glorious battles, but in darkness, at sea, without warning. On April 7, 1945, when the battleship Yamato sailed on her final mission toward Okinawa, she carried only enough fuel for a one-way trip. That decision, suicide by design, was the final proof. The submarine campaign had already won. Japan's arteries were severed. The empire was bleeding out. When the war ended in August 1945, American submarines, just 2% of the U.S. Navy's personnel, had sunk over 1,300 Japanese ships, including 8 aircraft carriers, 1 battleship, and the majority of Japan's merchant fleet. It was one of the most efficient and devastating campaigns in naval history. The Japanese High Command never truly expected this. They had prepared for surface fleets, for air raids, for decisive battles between giants of steel. They had not prepared for quiet men in cramped hulls, stalking the sea lanes, turning logistics into a weapon. And long after the guns fell silent, the ocean kept its secrets. Oil-slicked water, broken hulls, and the echo of an explosion no one in Tokyo ever heard coming.